The forest had a way of swallowing sound, as if every footstep was being pressed into wet earth and erased before it could echo. Trees leaned inward, their branches knotted together like crooked fingers conspiring above the narrow trail. The locals said the woods were older than the town itself, older than the names carved into headstones, and that once the sun dipped below the ridge line, the forest stopped belonging to the living. It was just past dusk when the first smile appeared. At least, that's how it felt, like something had appeared, fully formed, waiting. A pale curve of teeth, faintly visible between the trunks, hovering where no face should have been. The light was wrong there, thinner somehow, stretched and trembling as if afraid to linger. Whoever stood in the shadows didn't move. Didn't blink. Just smiled. Those who claimed to see it all described the same detail. The smile was too calm. Not wild, not feral, not the grin of someone trying to frighten you. It was patient. Knowing. As though it had been there long before you arrived and would remain long after you fled. People began avoiding the trail, but the forest didn't release them so easily. Hunters swore they felt watched, their skin prickling with the certainty of eyes following every step. Campers woke in the night to find their fires reduced to cold ash while something breathed softly beyond the reach of the flames. And always, just before panic set in, there it was again, that quiet, deliberate smile, suspended in the darkness. No footprints were ever found. No broken branches. No sign that anyone had been standing there at all. Yet the feeling lingered, seeping into dreams and waking thoughts alike, as if the forest itself had learned how to smile. The first key turning point begins with the moment the smile is seen for the very first time, not as a dramatic reveal but as an unsettling accident of perception. It happens to someone who has no reason to be afraid, someone familiar with the woods who has walked the trail dozens of times without incident. The evening is ordinary, the air heavy with the smell of damp leaves and pine sap, the kind of quiet that feels peaceful rather than threatening. This normalcy is important because it makes what follows impossible to dismiss as imagination or fear. When the person notices movement between the trees, it doesn't register as danger at first. It feels like noticing a shadow shift or a branch sway. Only when the eyes adjust does the shape become clearer, resolving into something undeniably human yet completely wrong. What freezes them in place is not a face, but a smile detached from context. Teeth visible where light should not reach, lips curved with deliberate precision, as if the expression was practiced over time. The rest of the face is swallowed by darkness, refusing to emerge no matter how the angle changes. The smile doesn't widen or falter. It holds steady, calm, aware. In that instant, the forest seems to close in, sounds thinning out until even the insects fall silent, creating the impression that whatever is smiling has silenced the woods by its presence alone. The observer feels an irrational certainty that the smile is not reacting to being seen, but has been waiting to be noticed. Panic doesn't come immediately. Instead, there is a moment of disbelief, the mind searching for explanations that might preserve reality. A trick of the light. Someone playing a joke. An animal baring its teeth. Each possibility collapses under scrutiny because none explain the stillness, the patience, or the unmistakable sense of intent. When the person finally steps back, heart racing, the smile does not retreat. It doesn't advance either. It simply remains, as if distance and movement are irrelevant to it. The turning point solidifies when the observer flees the trail and reaches safety, only to realize the fear hasn't stayed behind in the woods. The image of the smile lingers with unnatural clarity, resurfacing when they close their eyes, appearing in reflections, in the curve of shadows along walls. What began as a single sighting transforms into something invasive, suggesting that seeing the smile was not a passive act but an invitation, a moment of recognition that cannot be undone. The second key turning point unfolds as the initial sighting spreads beyond a single person and begins to fracture the sense of isolation that once protected the town from its own fears. At first, the witness keeps the experience private, embarrassed by how unreal it sounds, but subtle changes in behavior attract attention. Sleepless nights, sudden silences in conversation, an unwillingness to go near the woods after sunset all raise quiet concern. When the truth finally surfaces, it does not come out as a dramatic confession, but as a hesitant admission shared with someone who unexpectedly responds with recognition rather than doubt. That recognition is what shifts everything. Another person admits they have seen it too, though in a different part of the forest and on a different night. Their description matches too closely to ignore: the same unmoving smile, the same absence of a visible face, the same overwhelming sense of being noticed rather than threatened. Soon, more stories emerge, exchanged in low voices and uneasy glances, usually prefaced with assurances that the speaker knows how ridiculous it sounds. The similarities are too precise to dismiss as coincidence. None of the witnesses ever see the smile approach, speak, or vanish in a conventional way. It simply ceases to be visible when they can no longer bear to look, as if it withdraws on its own terms. As accounts accumulate, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The sightings occur along old trails, forgotten clearings, and areas where the forest seems unnaturally dense, places avoided by animals and rarely visited except by those who know the woods well. The smile never appears to outsiders or tourists, only to locals who have spent years moving through the trees without fear. This selective nature introduces a more unsettling idea than the existence of something strange in the forest. It suggests intention, discrimination, perhaps even familiarity. The emotional shift is subtle but devastating. What was once a personal terror becomes a shared secret, and shared secrets carry weight. People begin questioning their memories of the woods, recalling moments when they felt watched long before the first confirmed sighting. Childhood dares, late-night walks, solitary hunts that ended early for reasons they could never explain all take on new meaning. The forest stops being a backdrop and starts feeling like an active presence, one that has been observing quietly, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. This turning point ends not with panic, but with a deeper, more corrosive fear as the community realizes the smile is not tied to a single witness or a single night, and that seeing it may mean something has already been set in motion that no one understands how to stop. The third key turning point emerges when the forest begins to exert its presence beyond mere sightings, manifesting in subtle, unnerving ways that challenge the townspeople's sense of safety and reality. At first, the changes are easy to dismiss: a snapped branch here, a footprint there, shadows that seem to linger longer than they should. But over time, these occurrences grow more deliberate and specific, almost as if the woods themselves are learning to communicate. Those who once walked confidently through familiar trails begin to notice that paths seem rearranged, trees lining corridors that were never there before, underbrush thickened where it had been open, and familiar landmarks subtly shifted, confusing orientation. Even the soundscape betrays the uncanny: wind rustles differently, animals retreat abruptly, and silence arrives too quickly, replacing expected noises with a void that presses against the mind. The person who first saw the smile returns to the woods despite warnings, compelled by a mixture of fear and an unexplainable need to confront what has been haunting them. Each visit reinforces the sense that the forest itself is alive in a predatory, watchful way. Shadows stretch in impossible directions, light bends through the branches unnaturally, and the feeling of being followed is almost physical, tugging at the spine and making every movement cautious. Then, the smile appears again, but this time in a place where logic dictates it should not exist, visible from a clearing, partially reflected in a pool of water, as if the woods themselves are choosing to display it. Its presence is no longer accidental. It feels like a calculated assertion, a demonstration of power that destabilizes the observer's grasp on reality. Neighbors begin reporting that they too feel the influence of the woods even without seeing the smile. Windows are found open in the morning when they were closed at night, items are inexplicably moved, and pets grow restless, refusing to enter the forest and whining toward the darkened tree line. The phenomenon becomes increasingly invasive, eroding the boundary between the forest and the town. Fear spreads quietly but inexorably, not through direct confrontation but through the unsettling awareness that something is monitoring, cataloging, and choosing when to reveal itself. This turning point reaches its peak when the realization strikes that the smile is not merely an entity hiding in the shadows but part of a larger mechanism, a presence embedded in the forest that manipulates perception, anticipation, and memory. The woods no longer belong to the people who thought they knew them. The smile's existence is now a confirmation that the forest has its own intentions, and those who enter are entering into a world where the rules of visibility, time, and distance are no longer reliable. The sense of being watched becomes a constant companion, seeping into the waking hours and dreams alike, a persistent reminder that the forest's gaze is not limited to nightfall or the trail but extends to every corner where a mind remembers to fear. The fourth key turning point occurs when the forest's influence escalates from subtle manipulation to undeniable confrontation, turning curiosity and disbelief into terror that cannot be ignored. After repeated sightings, those who have encountered the smile begin noticing patterns in its appearances, an almost ritualistic quality in how and when it reveals itself. It never shows up during the day, and even at twilight, it is selective, appearing only to individuals who venture alone or who linger too long on certain paths. These patterns are impossible to explain rationally, yet they create an inescapable sense that the forest itself has rules, and that those rules are being enforced with deliberate precision. The realization is chilling. The smile is not random, it has strategy, patience, and a cold awareness of who is present and who is not. This awareness intensifies when the observer ventures deeper than before, past landmarks that had always offered comfort and familiarity. The trees grow closer together, their trunks warped and gnarled, forming natural corridors that funnel movement in directions that feel both predetermined and threatening. Every step taken seems to echo too loudly, every branch snapping too sharply, as though the forest responds to intrusions in real time. And then the smile appears again, not from a distance but closer than ever before, partially illuminated by slivers of moonlight that manage to filter through the dense canopy. It is no longer confined to shadows at the edge of perception, it is a presence, a participant in the forest's interaction with the observer. The calm, deliberate expression has not changed, yet its proximity amplifies the terror, making the observer acutely aware that it can see far more than can be seen in return. The psychological impact is immediate and profound. Thoughts become fragmented, memory falters, and simple movements, turning a corner, stepping over roots, raising a hand to shield the eyes, carry the weight of potential consequence. The observer begins to understand that fear itself is being manipulated, heightened, and directed, not by imagination but by an external intelligence that exists within the trees, the shadows, and the unseen spaces between them. Reports begin to emerge of other anomalies. Hikers lose track of time, wandering for hours though only minutes have passed. Sounds that should be distant come inexplicably close. Familiar trails loop back on themselves, as though the forest is testing those who enter. The smile, once a single enigmatic symbol, becomes the forest's method of communication, a signifier of attention, judgment, and perhaps something far darker. By this turning point, it is clear that the forest has moved beyond passive observation. It engages, provokes, and challenges those who enter, forcing recognition of the unnatural intelligence that permeates the shadows, and leaving the observer with the terrifying certainty that nothing in the woods is accidental or meaningless. The fifth key turning point emerges when the smile begins to affect not only those who enter the forest but the very fabric of their daily lives, turning what was once an external terror into an intimate and inescapable psychological threat. After repeated encounters, the observer notices that the image of the smile is no longer confined to the forest or nighttime hours. It creeps into reflections in mirrors, briefly visible in a windowpane as if staring in from the other side, and manifests in peripheral vision when walking through familiar streets or rooms. At first, these glimpses are fleeting, easy enough to dismiss as tricks of light or fatigue, but they grow increasingly persistent and specific. The observer begins to recognize the same curvature of teeth, the same impossibly calm expression, as though the forest has followed them out of the trees and implanted itself into their perception. Sleep becomes impossible. Dreams are invaded by shadows that coalesce into the smile, drifting slowly across rooms, hanging from ceilings, or waiting in corners where light refuses to reach. Each night reinforces the sense that the observer is being watched at all times, even when awake, and that the forest, or whatever inhabits it, is no longer bound by distance. Attempts to speak of these experiences are met with skepticism or dismissal, further isolating the observer and amplifying the terror. Friends and family notice a growing agitation, sudden withdrawals, and moments of staring blankly at nothing. The psychological weight of the smile begins to erode reason, creating a creeping paranoia that the world outside the forest is no longer safe or comprehensible. The turning point becomes undeniable when physical traces appear, subtle but impossible to explain, faint impressions in dust on windowsills, disturbances in soil near doorsteps, or the occasional sound of movement in empty rooms. These incidents suggest that the smile's presence has begun to exert influence beyond mere observation, blurring the line between perception and reality. The observer comes to understand that it is not simply a face in the shadows but a force capable of shaping environment and thought, extending its dominion beyond the confines of the forest. Fear evolves from a reaction to sight into an ongoing awareness, a persistent vigilance that colors every action and interaction. Ordinary life becomes a gauntlet, each moment charged with the possibility of encountering the impossible. The forest, and the smile it harbors, is no longer confined to nightfall or isolation. It has insinuated itself into consciousness, memory, and perception, creating a sense of vulnerability that cannot be escaped. By this point, the observer realizes that the smile is not only watching but learning, adapting, and asserting control in subtle, deliberate ways, reshaping reality itself to remind them that it is always present, always patient, and always waiting. The sixth key turning point occurs when the presence of the smile begins to assert itself with undeniable physicality, crossing the threshold from psychological dread into tangible, almost violent interaction with the environment. After weeks of creeping fear and whispered stories, the observer ventures back into the woods, drawn by a mixture of obsession, terror, and a desperate need for answers. The forest, which once appeared to shift subtly around them, now actively resists, forcing steps into unfamiliar paths, rearranging natural obstacles as if testing their resolve. Every snap of a twig, every brush of leaves against skin, carries an unmistakable weight, as though the smile has grown impatient with mere observation and demands engagement. The feeling is no longer just being watched, it is being herded, manipulated, and cornered by an intelligence that inhabits every shadow. This encounter marks a profound escalation when the smile manifests closer than ever before. The face emerges partially from the darkness, framed by twisted branches that seem to contort to display it, teeth catching faint moonlight in a way that feels deliberate, almost ceremonial. It doesn't move toward the observer, but the air around it seems charged, pressing in with suffocating intensity. The forest itself amplifies the presence, rustling and sighing as if exhaling in tandem with the smile's imperceptible motions. The observer experiences an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if the smile knows their fears, their memories, and even their secrets, turning private thoughts into vulnerabilities visible to the forest. Physical evidence of the smile's influence begins to appear in ways that cannot be rationalized. Footprints are discovered that do not match human form, twisted impressions in mud that vanish upon closer inspection. Trees bear scratches or markings that suggest deliberate shaping, as if the environment itself is learning to communicate through warning. The observer feels a pull toward these anomalies, compelled to investigate despite the danger, understanding that retreat is impossible until some unspoken demand is met. It is no longer a passive terror, it is active, insistent, and increasingly territorial. The psychological impact intensifies in tandem with these physical manifestations. Each encounter erodes the boundary between mind and forest, making the observer question whether the smile is confined to shadows or exists within their own perception, capable of projecting itself into reality at will. Sleep becomes fragmented into waking hallucinations, moments when the smile appears in empty rooms, reflected in surfaces, or lingering at doorways that were previously thought safe. Even attempts to flee the forest are thwarted by disorienting shifts in terrain and the sense that the smile is everywhere, patient yet intolerant of hesitation. By the time this turning point fully takes hold, the observer has come to a chilling understanding. The smile is no longer a simple apparition. It is a presence that commands both space and perception, bending the forest and reality to its will, asserting dominion in ways that defy logic, and marking the observer as irrevocably entwined in its design. The seventh key turning point occurs when the smile's presence becomes undeniably manipulative, no longer confined to fleeting appearances or subtle environmental disturbances, but actively influencing the decisions, thoughts, and emotions of those who have encountered it. The observer, now burdened with an obsessive awareness of the smile, begins noticing patterns in its behavior, as if it can anticipate actions before they happen. Paths that were once familiar feel deliberately confusing, and moments of hesitation seem to trigger responses: a rustle in the underbrush, a shadow that shifts just as the observer turns. It becomes impossible to distinguish between coincidence and intent, and the observer gradually realizes that the forest itself has become a conduit for the smile's influence, shaping perception to heighten anxiety, fear, and disorientation. As the smile asserts control over perception, reality begins to blur. The observer starts to experience vivid hallucinations intertwined with tangible stimuli. A fallen branch might resemble a hand reaching out, a pool of water reflects the face even when no one is nearby, and fleeting glimpses of motion at the edge of vision trigger visceral panic. The effect is cumulative, eroding confidence in memory, judgment, and the senses themselves. Every step deeper into the forest, or even the mere thought of returning, amplifies the sense that the smile is orchestrating events, predicting responses, and enforcing an unseen order. Ordinary objects, such as rocks, trees, or shadows, take on symbolic weight, appearing to carry the deliberate mark of a presence that is both patient and omniscient. This turning point becomes particularly harrowing when the observer attempts to share their experiences. Others who have encountered the smile react with a mixture of fear, disbelief, or subtle recognition, suggesting that the phenomenon is selective and intelligent, appearing only to those who can perceive it or who have already been marked by previous sightings. The forest itself seems to reinforce isolation, discouraging communication and fostering suspicion, leaving the observer to navigate a labyrinth of both physical terrain and psychological terror. Fear becomes an instrument of control, a method by which the smile ensures compliance and attention without any overt action. The escalation culminates in a moment of near confrontation. The observer, drawn by compulsion, steps into a clearing where the smile appears fully illuminated, framed by trees whose twisted forms seem deliberately arranged. The face does not move or speak, yet its presence exerts a suffocating psychological force, demanding recognition, commanding attention, and creating a tangible sense of inevitability. Time and distance lose meaning, and the observer is left with the unnerving awareness that the smile has the power to manipulate not only perception and environment but also the very choices that determine whether one survives or loses oneself entirely to the forest's unseen will. By this point, it becomes clear that the smile is no longer a passive enigma. It has become an intelligent, deliberate force capable of bending reality and psychology alike, asserting dominion in ways that leave those it observes vulnerable, disoriented, and irrevocably entwined in its dark design. The eighth key turning point occurs when the smile begins to manipulate the observer's sense of time, space, and memory, turning encounters from terrifying sightings into profound existential disorientation. By this stage, the individual has already experienced multiple appearances, each leaving psychological residue that seeps into daily life, yet nothing prepares them for the forest's increasing capacity to distort reality itself. Trails that were once familiar twist in ways that defy logic, distances stretch and shrink unpredictably, and landmarks seem to vanish or rearrange themselves, creating an impression that the forest is not a static place but a living, sentient labyrinth. Every step forward carries uncertainty, every glance over a shoulder amplifies the fear that the smile is closer than it should be, or perhaps moving through space in ways that the mind cannot track. This turning point intensifies when the observer begins noticing inconsistencies in memory. Events from prior visits to the woods blur together, and recollections of safe passages now conflict with the physical reality before them. Paths once considered direct lead to areas previously unseen, or loop back impossibly, creating the sensation of endless wandering. The smile, always present in these moments, seems to exploit these disorientations deliberately, appearing in glimpses through gaps in the trees, reflecting off water, or floating in the peripheral vision in ways that reinforce a creeping sense of helplessness. The forest has moved from being merely threatening to being actively manipulative, a place where perception itself can no longer be trusted. The observer also notices the psychological implications of the smile's presence in more intimate ways. Thoughts once private are interrupted by intrusive images of the face, unbidden and vivid. Sleep becomes fractured, with dreams blending into waking hallucinations, each moment filled with the unsettling awareness that the smile is monitoring, waiting, and perhaps even judging. The forest's influence begins to extend beyond its physical boundaries, seeping into consciousness in the form of anxiety, hyperawareness, and paranoia. Ordinary activities are colored by anticipation, as if the mind is constantly expecting the impossible to intrude, and the observer becomes hypervigilant, scanning shadows and surfaces for the familiar curve of teeth and the unnervingly calm expression. This stage represents a profound shift in the stakes. The smile is no longer a passive phenomenon that can be avoided by staying away from the woods. It has become an active agent, capable of infiltrating perception, manipulating memory, and warping space in ways that make escape and comprehension increasingly tenuous. The observer begins to understand that each encounter is not random but purposeful, a systematic erosion of confidence in one's own senses and a deliberate expansion of the smile's dominion beyond the shadows of the trees. By the end of this turning point, the boundary between the forest, the smile, and the mind has become indistinguishable, leaving the observer trapped in a reality where the rules they once trusted no longer apply, and where the smile's presence is an ever-present, inexorable force. The ninth key turning point occurs when the smile's presence shifts from subtle manipulation to a direct, almost personal engagement, transforming the forest from a threatening backdrop into an interactive, sentient adversary. By this point, the observer has endured repeated sightings, disorienting shifts in terrain, and psychological invasions into sleep and memory, but the smile's influence escalates in a way that is both intimate and terrifying. It becomes clear that it is not merely observing or haunting, it is responding, learning, and anticipating behavior. Trails that were once passable now funnel movement toward specific clearings, gaps in the trees seem arranged to frame its appearance, and shadows lengthen unnaturally to suggest a presence even before it is seen. The observer begins to feel an almost tactile awareness of the smile's focus, as if the forest itself is a lens concentrating attention on them alone. The turning point solidifies during a confrontation in which the observer, compelled by both dread and curiosity, steps into a clearing where the smile manifests fully, emerging from the shadows in an impossible, deliberate composition. The face, pale and calm, is framed by twisted branches that seem to mimic the contours of human form yet distort it just enough to unsettle the senses. The smile does not move forward, speak, or gesture, yet its effect is immediate and suffocating. Time slows, perception warps, and the observer feels a chilling sense of recognition. The smile knows them. It is aware of their fear, their hesitation, even their past decisions, creating a suffocating intimacy that makes escape feel impossible. The forest reinforces this effect, pressing in from all sides, its sounds muted and its presence oppressive, amplifying the psychological weight of the encounter. The observer's mind begins to fracture under the strain. Each heartbeat echoes with anticipation of the smile's next movement, and ordinary reasoning collapses in the face of an entity that seems capable of bending perception itself. Attempts to rationalize the event fail. Light, shadow, and distance all behave unpredictably, suggesting that the smile can manipulate the environment at will. The forest becomes a mirror of inner terror, reflecting and amplifying anxiety, paranoia, and dread. Even when leaving the clearing, the observer carries a lingering, visceral awareness that the smile has left a mark, a subtle but inescapable influence on thought, memory, and behavior. By the end of this turning point, it is undeniable that the smile is an intelligent, purposeful presence. It is no longer a passive anomaly in the shadows but an entity capable of interacting with reality, shaping the forest, and manipulating perception to assert control. The observer understands that each encounter is not random, each appearance is deliberate, and the smile has elevated the stakes. It is no longer content to watch from the darkness, it is actively engaging, and its focus is unyielding, patient, and inescapable. The 10th key turning point reaches the story's most harrowing escalation, when the smile moves from being a distant, manipulative presence to an immediate, unavoidable force that confronts the observer with the full weight of its intent. By this stage, previous encounters have eroded confidence, disoriented perception, and invaded both waking and sleeping life, but nothing has prepared the observer for the sense of inevitability that accompanies the smile's final assertion. It becomes clear that avoidance is no longer possible. The forest itself seems to conspire to ensure confrontation. Familiar trails distort into corridors of anticipation, trees twist into unnatural shapes that frame unseen vantage points, and shadows gather in unnatural concentrations, as if the environment is actively orchestrating the appearance of the smile. The tension is suffocating, the air thick with expectation, and every sound, no matter how minor, carries the weight of impending revelation. The turning point crystallizes when the observer, compelled by a mixture of fear, desperation, and an unshakable need for understanding, enters a secluded clearing deep within the forest. Here, the smile reveals itself fully, not partially hidden in shadows or glimpsed from afar, but present in a way that makes avoidance impossible. It does not move, speak, or exhibit aggression in a conventional sense, yet its presence dominates the clearing entirely. The observer senses that the smile has been tracking every thought, every hesitation, every instinctive movement, responding to them in real time without motion or sound. The forest amplifies this encounter, holding back familiar nocturnal noises and casting every tree, branch, and shadow into a deliberate composition that focuses attention on the calm, unsettling expression. The face seems to exude patience, intelligence, and an understanding that the observer cannot comprehend, creating a suffocating psychological pressure. In this moment, the observer realizes that the smile is not just a phenomenon of sight or perception but a force capable of bending reality and asserting control over the environment itself. Footprints appear and vanish without explanation, shadows lengthen unnaturally, and the sense of space warps, making the clearing feel simultaneously vast and confining. The smile's presence is personal, targeted, and inescapable, leaving no room for distraction or denial. Every instinct to flee is countered by an almost gravitational pull toward recognition, a sense that the encounter must be endured and understood, even if comprehension is impossible. By the end of this turning point, the observer understands that the smile is not merely observing but actively engaging, shaping perception, environment, and fear with deliberate intention. Its patience is infinite, its awareness absolute, and its dominion complete within the forest. The encounter cements the understanding that once the smile has taken notice, there is no retreat from its gaze, no forgetting its presence, and no escape from the consequences of having entered a space where reality, perception, and terror have been irrevocably intertwined.